Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 20th of May, and today we are talking about the final complete fall of Bakhmut. The Russians control 100% of the city, and I should change the color of the marking of the city of Bakhmut from black, which is contested, to red, which is under Russian control. So we're going to talk about what happened over the past few days from May 17th to May 20th. Basically, the events leading up to the complete fall, and then where do we go from here? What are the implications of this fall, and how will the Russians move on? How will the Ukrainians improvise? How will they deal with this loss? Let's begin by going back to May 17th, 3 days ago, when the Russian and Wagner forces, they crossed the garage defense line that I've been talking about pretty extensively for the past few weeks. This was basically the last Ukrainian defensive line in the northwestern corner of the city of Bakhmut, basically spanning the entire residential area in the northwestern corner, and it was fortified by these pretty dense concrete garages that were spread out throughout the entire line in northwestern Bakhmut. So the Russians, they were able to cross this line, and they occupied the houses to the west of it, and so they reached some of the key supply routes into Bakhmut. And not just the ones supplying the northwestern corner, but also the ones that lead in from the northwestern corner and Kromove into the citadel, whatever was remaining of it. Because remember, at this time, the Russians did have positions within the citadel already. They had already split it in half. Okay. And at the same time, the Ukrainians, they were launching their own counterattacks. And so this is something that keeps popping up. It's a recurring theme, that even as the Russians are making their gains within the city of the Bakhmut itself, the Ukrainians have been making some very interesting moves on the flanks. And it's not enough for an all-out counterattack, but they have been really trying to conduct these localized counterattacks in order to make it as difficult as possible for the Russians to continue their advances, not just in Bakhmut itself, but on the flanks. And so Sako and Vincenty, which the Russians took a while back, pretty sure it was like in February or March, in recent weeks, the Ukrainians have been conducting some offensive activities over here. So they first of all began a few weeks ago by assaulting the western part of the town around the Vasyukivka River, just a minor assault to push them back towards the town itself and push them back from the river. And now they have also conducted assaults from the north. So this occurred on May 17th. The Ukrainian forces in this area, which I would assume are pretty minimal, but if they are present, then they're probably from the 10th Brigade, which is the unit stationed in Rozdolivka. It's actually the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade, and so they probably launched attacks, and they were responsible for assaulting the Russian positions to the north of the Vasyukivka River, which pushed back the Russians from their northernmost positions back into the town of Sako and Vincenty. And this is a good forward position, but again, it is isolated by the fact that it is in between two rivers, Vasyukivka and Bakhmutovka, and that it is so isolated from the main Russian logistics lines and the main Russian effort, the main Russian push, which is in the city of Bakhmut itself and on its flanks. Sako and Vincenty is it's sort of been put on the back burner in recent months, and so Ukraine has been capitalizing on that. Now, at the same time, the Ukrainians also launched additional localized counterattacks onto the open fields to the south of Ivanivske. They took over this plot of land, so it is a pretty sizable chunk. Probably some trenches over there that were overtaken, but the situation seems to have stabilized since then. At the same time, the Ukrainians actually pushed back the Russians from their positions to the west of the Donbass Canal. So here's the canal, and Russians originally held positions around over here. They had this entire polygon over in control, the one that I just circled. So they had positions in some key trenches, some key roads, some key forest belts, bush lines, and the Russians were forced to withdraw. I don't know if it was a Russian withdrawal or Ukrainian offensive, but either way, the Russians have set up their new positions across the canal on the eastern side of it, shortening the front line and basically going to more defendable positions. And so even as the Ukrainians were making the last stand within the apartment buildings within the city of Bakhmut, the Ukrainians, nonetheless, they were continuing to distract the Russians by conducting these offensive activities on the flanks. Now, at the same time, by May 18th, the Russian forces had taken over the entire citadel area, and they also took over most of the northwestern corner. So let's try to map this out in the most accurate way possible. And so the Russians, they already had positions in the eastern part of the citadel. They had control over this square area, and the Ukrainians, they still had control over this western part of the citadel. And so in the days after I uploaded my video, which I think I uploaded like 4 or 5 days ago, the Ukrainians are basically squeezed out because, again, the Russians took over the garage defensive line and were now in a position to flank the Ukrainian garrison that was still stationed within the citadel. And they were also fighting the Ukrainians in this children's hospital, where the Ukrainians made a last stand to try to protract the fighting for as long as possible. And so there is some fighting that occurred over there, but eventually the hospital fell as well. And so, yeah, you had these Ukrainian forces that were within this school and within some key apartment buildings that were totally isolated on 3 sides. And so really the best bet was to retreat to a new line, which was meant to be around this street over here. Let's actually zoom in to see what was going on around here. So we have here Uvilinia Street. This was supposed to be the new defensive line for the Ukrainians because, again, the citadel is generally thought of as this truncated cone over here. But to the south of Uvilinia Street, there are still some stores and some warehouses and some apartment buildings that are more so on the outskirts that still could be used effectively as defensive nodes. And so the Ukrainians, they were probably trying to set up some makeshift defenses over here just as a last stand, and a last stand within the last stand of the last stand. And so they were trying to set up defenses over here, but it was in futility because the Russians, they were able to cross over Uviliana Street and take over most of these apartment buildings. And the Ukrainians, they cannot do much about this due to the fact that they were so weakened from the fighting within the citadel. They weren't able to set up a new defensive line in the apartment buildings just to the south of it. And so the Russians, they took over the apartment buildings to the south and the source to the south, and they also took over some of the towns on some of the houses to the west of this garage area. So I'm going to circle generally how that looks like. They took over these areas basically. And so again, you can see how from the northwest they're advancing, within the citadel they're advancing. So what's left of Bakhmut then? What's left of the Ukrainian garrison in Bakhmut? Well, I'll show you guys what was left of it as of May 18th, at the end of May 18th. Well, the main dividing line was Tchaikovskogo Street, a street that I've talked about ad nauseum by now because it was really the main supply route into Bakhmut from the south for a very long time, and it was also the dividing line between the Russian and Ukrainian forces in the southern part of Bakhmut, or if we were to put it more accurately, the southwestern part of Bakhmut. And so here's how the front line looked like after the Russian gains on May 18th. It looked something like this, just a rough sketch. And so you can see how the front line was really centered around Tchaikovskogo Street, the street that's in yellow over here. And so the Russians, their goal was not a head-on assault onto the main Ukrainian positions within this final cluster of Ukrainian resistance. Instead, they wanted to flank it from the north, and so that's what they went ahead with. Because again, the main Ukrainian force within this cluster was in this industrial or warehouse facility, which I'm circling. Okay, so on May 19th, the Russians, they conducted the beginning of this flanking operation, and they took over the Holy Annunciation Church, or whatever's left of it. So that church is over here. I'll circle it. There's a marker if you want to click on that video and see how the ruins of the church look like. And so this was the beginning of taking over some of the key defensive nodes that were protecting the northern flank of the Ukrainians in this direction. They also pushed through some of the more rural-esque or suburb-esque streets that are on the outskirts of Bakhmut, such as Bulavina Street over here, trying to push through and flank the Ukrainian positions. And so they were able to take over what was left of the houses over here. There was some artillery duels, and there's some videos here that I have linked showing how the Russians were shelling the remaining Ukrainian positions. And at the same time, the Ukrainians, they vacated their remaining positions around the northeastern corner or the northwestern corner, because even though most of the houses within the northwestern corner were under Russian control due to their previous gains, Ukrainians, they still did have some positions in the farmlands that were just to the west of it. And so there were some rural dachas and some key agricultural fields under their control, which they eventually vacated once they realized the situation was not under their control anymore. And the Russians were beginning to set up positions within the apartment buildings that were still standing, which could be used to fire upon the Ukrainians that were located on the flatlands within these fields. And so the Ukrainians, they made their final retreat from the northwestern corner towards the town of Kromove. And as they were making this withdrawal, the Russians rained down very heavy artillery fire onto them. And so that's why the front line looks like it does right now in this specific area, with the contrast between the orange color and the just the neutral color. Okay, so by May 20th, the Ukrainians, they saw that there was really no way for them to continue the defense, and that they wanted to preserve their manpower, they wanted to preserve what was left of their force, and then withdraw it, at least in the most intact way possible. And so in that regard, you could say they were successful because they were not encircled, because they were able to maintain control of the supply lines up until the very last moment. And so on May 20th, which is today, technically, the Ukrainian garrison, which was really shrunk to just a single small cluster, which is like 0.6 square kilometers, they were forced to withdraw from their remaining positions in Bakhmut. And they probably moved to the nearby town of Ivanivske, which is heavily fortified from all sides with many, many units. And so they will be safe for now within that town. And so it is really the end of the era in that regard. And at the same time, the Ukrainians that were retreating from Kromove, because they did have to vacate Kromove, they set up their own new positions just to the north of Kromove in the trenches that they had recently retaken from the Russians in their minor counterattack. And so Kromove right now is a bit of a gray zone because it's so close to Bakhmut that the Ukrainians don't want to hold positions over there. You could basically say it's just an extension of the northwestern corner in that regard. And so holding positions within Kromove is extremely dangerous for the Ukrainians, especially with the Russians setting up positions in apartment buildings and with the Russians shelling Kromove nonstop. And so the Ukrainians just decided to make the decision that I think is wise to totally retreat from Kromove and set up new positions within the trench lines. And so what this does is that they give up Kromove, but they're still able to control the northern flank and control some of the key fields that are in between the current Russian front line and the city of Chasiv Yar. Because again, we need to remember that just because Bakhmut fell doesn't mean this war is over. Far from it. Not even the Battle of Donbass is close to over. Not even the battle for the second Ukrainian defensive line, which is like the one from Chasiv Yar to Seversk or whatever. Maybe from Raya Alexandrivka to Chasiv Yar. That line is still incredibly fortified. And that's only the intermediary line between the main Bakhmut-Seversk line to the line from Konstantinivka to Slavyansk. Just like zoom out for a second, because I know that I zoom in a lot and it's hard to see the wider picture. When you look at the wider picture, you see that there's these massive key defensive nodes that are just in Donbass alone, not even talking about the rest of Ukraine, but just talking about Eastern Europe, Eastern Ukraine in the specific moment. You have cities such as Slavyansk, just Kramatorsk, Druskivka, Konstantinivka. And if you zoom in, you have many others like Seversk, or you have Raya Alexandrivka, like I said before, Mykolaievka over here, Chasiv Yar. And they are all fortified using geographic features, using trenches, using defenses that are meant to defend against multiple axes of attack. And there are many units that have been either newly formed or that have been training for a very long time that are manning these key defensive nodes. But what I will say is that a lot of the Ukrainian garrison in Donbass has been severely weakened by the fighting in Bakhmut. And so I'm not trying to imply that the pace of the war will continue at the pace of the Battle of Bakhmut for basically forever. I'm trying to say that because as the Ukrainians lose more and more men, they will have to give up more land. They'll have to trade more land in order to preserve their manpower to a certain extent. And so they will have to sometimes give up certain small towns that only I would keep track of, that nobody else would really care about. And it might be significant within the context of a minor battle, but it might be what is necessary for the Ukrainians in order to preserve their main defensive lines in Donbass. And so I just want to reflect for a moment on the implications of the battle, because honestly, it is very, very impressive how the Ukrainians were able to hold out in the city for over 9 months. Remember, this entire battle began in July. I remember writing a community post about it where it said the Battle of Bakhmut has begun. Literally July of last year. That's crazy. It's almost like 1 year since then. And so you could see how the Wagner Group, they pushed in from the Eastern Industrial District, and they were holed up in there for a really long amount of time, maybe 4 or 5 months, before they actually penetrated the city itself from the Bakhmutka district. And remember, I made a video, I think it was in October, early October, about how the Wagner Group took over a garbage dump just to the southeast of the Bakhmutka district. And everybody's laughing because it's pretty funny to zoom in to such a microscopic level and title an entire video about how a specific garbage dump site was taken by the Russians. But that garbage dump site was basically the catalyst for Russia's taking over of Bakhmutka district. And then from there, the Bakhmutka district is what helped Russia take over the entirety of eastern Bakhmut. And so you can see the stepping stones. Step by step, the Russians took it over, and then the pace obviously began to really increase once the Russians gained control of key towns on the flanks and were able to create pockets of Ukrainian forces to the north and to the south, which forced them to withdraw from a lot of their territory that they had defended and set up a lot of defenses in. But either way, the Ukrainians were still able to maintain cohesiveness, at least relative cohesiveness. Sorry, they were able to maintain a pretty good supply line, both from the north and from the south. So from the north, it would be from the T0506 highway, and from the south, from the Ivanivsky highway, T0504. And despite multiple Russian attempts at trying to cut off these roads, and we talked about them ad nauseum over the past few months, the Ukrainians, at every single time that their roads were threatened, they were able to push them back. The most recent example would be early May, where the Russians were able to take over the key trench lines just to the north of the T0506 highway. But then the Ukrainians launched a counterattack, and they were able to retake all of the trenches and then some. And so we know that they have had the capability for an active defense and for counterattacks, and that they have been able to protect their flanks. They have been able to protect from encirclements. The way that the Russians won this battle is very interesting, because we were all expecting some sort of encirclement, or at least some sort of pocket to be formed that the Ukrainians could be squeezed out of, but none of that has actually happened. The way that the Wagner Group and the Russians in general took over the city of Bakhmut was just by assaulting it head on and breaking it up one by one, bit by bit, within the city itself. And I think that's what Ukraine was aiming for. I think they aimed for it because it would expend resources from the Russian side, and because it would extend the amount of time that they would be fighting within the city of Bakhmut for as long as possible. And so, in that regard, we have to give Ukraine credit. Also, we got to give them credit for the fact that they were able to, in recent days, take over key territory to the south of Ivanivsky and to the north of Kremovet. This will strengthen their flanks, and it will make it harder for the Russians to launch an attack onto Chasiv Yar, because really the only way to attack Chasiv Yar is by crossing over the Donbass Canal, and that can only be done from a few key crossings. And the Ukrainians, the geography favors them in Chasiv Yar. They are on a ridge, they are on the high ground, and they will use the forest, they will use the rivers, they will use the roads, they will use the bridges, they will use the canal itself as defensive lines. And it's going to be a gargantuan task, I believe, for the Russians to come up with a new battle plan for how they're going to take over Chasiv Yar. And so I think for the time being, they won't try to do that head on, or they won't even try to take over key cities on the flanks head on. They're just going to try to shape the battlefield in a way which will make it suitable for them to attrit the Ukrainian forces for the time being. So that's what I see happening, at least. And just one final note is that the Ukrainian casualties have absolutely have been absolutely astounding in this battle. And that could be a big part of the reason why they were able to hold out for those 9 months. Here's a list from this account over here talking about all of the units that suffered material casualties in Bakhmut. I can't confirm that they were decimated, but I can confirm that all these units were at least involved in the fighting in Bakhmut. In that, just given the nature of the fighting in Bakhmut, that they all suffered probably some sort of notable casualties. And so you can look through here. There's units from the regular Ukrainian army. There's units that fought in Kherson and Zaporozhye. There were ones that fought in taking back Kharkiv and parts of Luhansk. There's units that were basically paramilitary organizations until the beginning of the war, like the Kraken Battalion or the 5th Assault Regiment, which is associated with the Azov grouping. You also have numerous special forces, numerous UAV groups that conducted all these different reconnaissance operations. You have these foreign legions like Normandy Legion, these Chechen legions, these Free Russia legions. All of them got impacted to a certain extent. So not all of them got wiped out, but again, their forces got depleted, and even if they could be replaced by some sort of conscript, they're not ever going to live up to the same standard of quality as a highly trained professional. So that's just the truth of the matter. And one last thing, and I know I said before that would be the last thing, but one last thing actually is that according to the Wagner Group, they will be withdrawing from eastern Ukraine on May 25th, and they will be giving up their positions to the Russian ground forces. And this is upon the conclusion of the Battle of Bakhmut. This is according to them. I have learned from previous experiences not to trust anything that comes out of the Wagner Group's mouth, and so make of it what you will. It's possible that they're taking a break in order to recuperate and in order to give some like replenishment time and just for troop rotations purposes. And so you might see the Chechens take over for the time being, and they can continue the assaults. And then also the Russian regular army will have to pick up the slack because Wagner Group's been carrying them in this area for a very long time. And yeah, that's really it in terms of the situation in Bakhmut. It really is the end of an era in that regard, because really this has been the main focal point of the entire war for so long. And I could see why, because the priorities of the war have shifted from taking over all of Ukraine to taking over Donbass, liberating Donbass, according to Putin's perspective. And so in that regard, Bakhmut is very important in securing the local region. But when you zoom out, we have to acknowledge that there's a lot more work to be done. So, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.